Hi, this is Tawny from the Dirty Bits podcast, and you're listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by Blubrry. Blubrry offers the best media hosting, accurate listening stats, their all-new PowerPress Deluxe sites, a no-setup WordPress website for your podcast, and it comes with all of the necessary links to share your show with the world built right in. Visit us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up for media hosting, a PowerPress Deluxe site, get that podcast you've been dreaming about started, and get your first month on us. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream. And now, on to the show. Dreamers, I have a question for you to think about for a moment. When you think of some well-known cases out there, murder cases specifically, cases like the Black Dahlia, or the Boy in the Box, or JonBenet Ramsey, or Amber Hagerman, cases that are unsolved, do you ever wonder what became of their killers? Was this a one-time thing for them? Did they never again murder anyone else? Did they get into some other kind of trouble and end up in jail for a long period of time? Maybe they passed away, sometime not too long after the killing was committed, taking their dark secrets to the grave with them. Maybe that act of killing just one victim was enough to cause them to decide they knew all that they needed to know and never committed a crime like that ever again. Could it have been something that they did in a moment that was so completely off the wall, so out of character, it was something that would turn out to be the worst thing they'd ever do in their entire life, and they managed to get away with it? Never again to do anything remotely close to it, and never told anyone about it? That's a pretty heavy secret to bear for so many years, isn't it? That can't possibly be easy. Holding on to something like that, keeping it to yourself, wouldn't it eat away at a person? I guess it depends on the kind of person they are. If they were the kind of person that had no conscience, the deep feelings of guilt and regret did not wear them down over the years. Or maybe there was just too much to lose to reveal the truth. Take a case like JonBenet Ramsey, for example. I don't know what the popular theory is regarding her death amongst us who listen to California Dreaming, but assuming it was someone in the family, say like Burke Ramsey, that he had a hand in killing her and his parents were the ones who concocted the cover-up to save him from spending many, many years in juvenile detention or institutionalized. That would be an example where they allowed the truth to stay hidden in order to keep this dark secret from destroying their family. That is assuming you believe the scenario that Burke killed JonBenet in the motherlode of hissy fits when she snatched up a piece of his pineapple. We don't have to go down the rabbit hole of what is the Ramsey family. It's just an example of the worst moment in your life turning into the worst kept secret in the world. For every unsolved murder out there, there is a person in the world that somewhere, somehow, got away with it. Unless you're Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac, then you managed to get away with several murders. But unsolved serial killing is different because they didn't just stop after one. They kept going until something caused them to stop. Either they died or perhaps they experienced a come-to-God moment and stopped on their own. For this story, I'm talking about the one-and-done murderer. The unknown man or woman who, for whatever reason, committed a murder and never did it again and never got caught. They did what they did and decided to go on to live an uneventful, unassuming life, relegating that heinous act to becoming a part of a past they are intent on keeping buried, never breathing a word of it to anyone, and never allowing it to seep into their thoughts for the rest of time. And they end up taking their secrets to the grave, without ever harming another human being again for the remainder of their existence. While there is something to be said for a person who is capable of engaging in that type of behavior, for one thing, there's a sense of relief that no other person was ever harmed because of the actions of this person, despite the fact that they have a dark secret hovering over them. They were able to move on and live a full, productive, meaningful life. And I do believe that it is very possible to do so. The further removed the person becomes from the crime, the less and less it remains a part of their reality. And soon, it becomes forgotten, as if it never ever happened. One case that comes to mind right away is the story of Stephanie Lazarus. She's the star of one of my favorite cold case stories out there. I have yet to tell her story to you guys. It's only because several really, really good podcasts have already covered her story in recent times. And it is a case out of California, but I just don't think I'd have that much to add to the story. Anyway, if you're not familiar with it, Stephanie Lazarus was the LAPD officer who shot and killed a romantic rival back in 1986. She was finally connected to the crime through DNA testing in 2009 and went on to be convicted of first-degree murder in 2012. In the ensuing years following the murder, she continued to enjoy a stellar career as an LAPD officer. Working her way up to detective, she was highly decorated and a well-regarded member of the force. That is, all the way up until that pesky murder came back to bite her in the butt 23 years later. That's what I'm talking about. Going on with your life, not only never committing another crime of that magnitude again, but she would go on to work shoulder to shoulder with the very people who put criminals like her away, who've done the exact same thing that she's done, except she's been able to keep her secrets buried deep into the past. But as for Lazarus, the secrets didn't stay buried forever. Sometimes you get found out, because no matter how far removed you think you are from what you've done, things like murder, they never ever go away. A case may grow cold, family members may pass away, but I can guarantee it that that victim's case file is never going to disappear. Someday, it's going to land on the desk of just the right detective who is going to start digging, taking a look at what you did so many years earlier, now with a fresh set of eyes and a whole arsenal of modern technology that didn't exist, which enabled you to skirt the system all those years. And you thought you'd go the rest of your life never having to concern yourself with the life you stole. Well, guess what? No matter how much time elapses, there is one thing that will never change. And that's the part of you that you left behind when you took that life. And that, my friend, is what is guaranteed to come back to haunt you. Because I promise you, that detective holding that piece of you in his or her hand and has stared at it, examined it, lost sleep over it, had nightmares about it, they are bound and determined to make sure the secrets that you are keeping don't stay buried forever. And perhaps you took something with you when you made off that night, something that marked you for your life. In today's 42nd episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the scars we bear. Gerald Mason was born January 26, 1934 in Columbia, South Carolina. By the time he was 22 years old, he would have become what you might call a drifter, a person with no real place to stay, no job to speak of, and no real consistent means of supporting himself. But I really don't feel like Mason's personal experience is a true reflection of what the climate in America was like at the time. At the start of the 1950s, the United States had become the strongest military power on the planet. The economy was flourishing, and more people were able to have access to things they hadn't before. New cars, houses in the suburbs, all the perks of a booming economy. And speaking of booms, the baby boom was in full swing as well. And when all was said and done, 77 million babies were born during that era. President Harry S. Truman ushered in the decade, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower ushered it out. Queen Elizabeth II took the throne, and she is still sitting on it. It was during this time that the Cold War had its beginnings. The Korean War happened. The Vietnam War got underway. Fidel Castro's revolution took over Cuba. And speaking of Cuba, I Love Lucy made its television premiere. The Catcher in the Rye was published, as was the very first Peanuts comic strip. Brown versus the Board of Education happened, desegregating schools in the United States. The Tonight Show made its debut, and Ray Kroc opened his very first McDonald's in San Bernardino, California, and Disneyland opened in Anaheim, California. Rosa Parks did her thing and refused to give up her seat on a bus when ordered to do so. James Dean was killed in an automobile crash on a California highway, and Elvis showed up on the Ed Sullivan Show. Color TV became a thing, and so did NASA, America's space program. It was a very prosperous time in the United States. And so that's a snapshot of where we were around this time Mason was drifting around. In 1956, he was arrested and served a bit of time for burglary. He was released the following year when he was 23, and it was then he decided it was time for a change of scenery. So, he hitchhiked west. He made a pit stop in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he stopped at a local Sears to purchase a gun. At the time, Sears was the largest gun dealer in the area. The clerk behind the counter that day was a young man named Billy Clark. He was only 18 years old at the time, and this was his very first job. He helped Mason choose a gun, which he explained he wanted for protection as he was traveling across the country. Billy showed him the one that was the cheapest one that they sold. A rare 9-shot Harrington and Richardson 22mm revolver costing $29.95. Billy made the sale, recorded the serial number of the weapon in a logbook, and had Mason sign it, which he did using an alias, G.D. Wilson. After that, Mason made it the rest of the way to his final destination, Southern California. On July 21st, 1957, 17-year-old Bob DeWar was with a friend of his and their dates, two 15-year-old girls. They had spent the summer evening at a party at a friend's house. After they had left the party, the four teenagers decided to make a pit stop at Lover's Lane in the city of Hawthorne, California, in a place where they could watch the planes land and take off, and maybe get a little frisky. And back then, just getting to kiss your girlfriend was a big deal, and this was actually his first time with a girl at Lover's Lane. As they sat in their vehicle, a 1949 Ford, the kids started kissing, and the windows started steaming up a little bit. Remember, this was summertime, and the nights are quite warm. So Bob cracked his window a little bit, and that's when he saw a man approach his vehicle. This man was Mason. As soon as his window came down, a gun was brandished and put through it close to Bob's head. The man said, "This is a robbery." Bob at first thought this was some kind of prank, but it wasn't. The gunman was very serious, and his revolver was very real and very loaded. He'd come prepared for this robbery. He'd been lying in wait. Aside from the revolver, he had a flashlight and surgical tape. He covered all of their eyes and bound their wrists with the tape and demanded that they strip down naked. Being held at gunpoint, naked, blindfolded, and hands bound, they did as they were told. Their fun night of partying and maybe a little bit of making out at Lover's Lane had just turned into a complete nightmare. As the four of them sat in that car, the gunman made his way around from the driver's side to the passenger side. He opened the door and forced one of the girls out of the vehicle, at which point he sexually assaulted her. Bob was convinced that they were going to die that night. This man had been so brazen and so violent. And what happened next was absolutely terrifying for the four teenagers. He demanded that they all get out of the vehicle. Bob was thinking, this is it. We're dead. And then the gunman said, I think I'm going to kill you. I want you to march out to the field. Bob could hear the girls crying, and his mind was in a blur, unsure if what he was experiencing was just some sort of bad dream that he couldn't wake up from. He thought, all this guy needs to do is put 1, 2, 3, 4 bullets into the back of each of our heads and it's over. We're dead. But that didn't happen. The gunman walked back to their vehicle. He got in, closed the door, turned on the headlights, and he drove off, leaving the four scared, naked, bound teenagers in that field. Alive. Frightened, but alive. Thankfully. So Mason found himself driving along in this stolen Ford. He had made his way a short distance west of where he had just terrorized those 4 teens to the nearby city of Manhattan Beach. He approached the intersection of Sepulveda Boulevard and Rosecrans Avenue, where the signal light was red. He did stop for the red light, but for some inexplicable reason, he, I assume, checked for any cross traffic and then proceeded to cross the intersection before the light had turned green. There's really been no explanation as to why he did that, and I can't really figure out why either. Why he would make this minor traffic violation. Maybe he was nervous or jittery. I don't know. But it was about to turn into the worst red light violation ever for the El Segundo Police Department. Parked nearby, there was a black and white patrol car, just off the side of the road, out of Mason's view, obviously. They saw him stop, and then they saw him not wait for the light to turn green. Sitting in that police cruiser were 2 El Segundo police officers, 25-year-old Milton Curtis and 28-year-old Richard Phillips. They immediately got behind Mason's vehicle and flipped on their lights to pull him and the 1949 Ford over for running that light. After a short pursuit, the vehicle finally came to a stop near the corner of Rosecrans and Palm Avenue. It was a sort of rural area, not too much around, some trees, a field, an oil refinery. Not much else to speak of. A second El Segundo police cruiser passed by the scene. Officers James Gilbert, 28 years old at the time, and Charlie Porter, 37 years old. They slowed down. Maybe they would be needed for backup. They were prepared to stop and help. But as they got closer, they could see that Officer Phillips looked as though he was going to issue that driver a ticket. They also observed Officer Curtis sitting inside the patrol car. He was in there waiting for the vehicle's information to be radioed back to him. Officer Phillips had a piece of paper in his hand. He waved at the passing cruiser, signaling that all was good. They had this traffic stop under control. So, Officers Gilbert and Porter carried on with their patrol. That would be the last time Officer Milton Curtis and Officer Richard Phillips would be seen alive. Mason was convinced that he was pulled over because the car he was driving was stolen, and it must have been reported. And if the stolen car had been reported, then what he'd done to those 4 teens must have been reported to police as well. 90 minutes had passed since he had left them in that field. Plenty of time for those kids to pull themselves together and alert authorities, right? Not quite. Officers Curtis and Phillips, in fact, had not gotten word of that crime. They had no idea that the man that they just pulled over for running a red light had just come from robbing a group of teens and sexually assaulting one of them. But Mason, he did not know that. He was thinking they've got him in a stolen car, assaulting a 15-year-old girl. He thinks they've got him. He thinks he's going to jail for a long, long time. So he made the decision that he was not going to let that happen. Not that night. It would be less than a minute later that those 2 officers who had slowed down, cruised by that traffic stop where they were waved off by the officers at the scene, would hear a crackling come over the radio. It was Officer Phillips, the one who'd waved at them. He radioed that they'd been shot and they need an ambulance. Officers Gilbert and Porter raced back to where they had just seen them. They had just been there, and they came back to find their fellow officers had been shot, both of them, 3 times. Officer Phillips was down on the ground, shot 3 times in the back, while he was in the middle of writing the moving violation ticket. He was still alive, barely, but he was mortally wounded. Officer Curtis was still seated in the patrol car, also with 3 gunshot wounds to his torso. He was already dead by the time they'd returned to the scene. As Mason had prepared to flee the scene, having cut down both of those officers, Officer Phillips did manage to return fire on the suspect, getting off 6 shots. 3 of those bullets struck the Ford, 2 through the back of the windshield, shattering it, leaving 2 bullet holes, 1 hitting the trunk, and the other 3 missed. Mason drove a few blocks and bailed out of the vehicle, fleeing on foot, hiding somewhere amongst the homes in Manhattan Beach. The deaths of Officer Phillips and Officer Curtis would deeply affect the 2 officers who had slowly cruised by, who had just moments before casually waved to their brother officers before carrying on. And their deaths would continue to affect the El Segundo Police Department for decades to come. Dreamers, Los Angeles County, the county which is the backdrop of our story, is considered one of the most dangerous places to be in law enforcement. Considering the population of more than 10 million people, yours truly included, it would actually make sense statistically. There are just so many people here. So much to police. There is hardly a day that goes by that an officer of the law isn't shot at or attacked. But back in 1957, this wasn't the case. Los Angeles County was a much safer community. It was an innocent time, so something like this to have happened was unprecedented. 2 officers shot dead in the line of duty while issuing a ticket. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And the community, especially El Segundo, would never be the same. Officer Phillips's radio call that they'd been shot and request for an ambulance came over the radio at 1:28 a.m. that morning, July 22nd, 1957. Officers Gilbert and Porter, knowing that they had just been there, rushed back as quickly as it could, and it took them less than a minute to do so. But in that painfully short window of time, the man in the Ford, the man who'd cut down their fellow officers in cold blood, had disappeared into the summer night. Every officer available, not only from the El Segundo department, but also from neighboring cities' departments as well, feverishly searched this area, known as the South Bay here in Southern California, for the entire night. Eventually, they discovered the stolen 1949 Ford, but the killer, he was gone. Mason had ditched it, likely believing that it had indeed been reported stolen and now very well could be connected to the murders of 2 police officers. Finding this killer became the top priority for nearly every police department in Southern California. Killing 2 of their own? No. They needed to catch this man and bring him to justice. The search continued on and on and on. But it was all in vain. Before long, this case grew ice cold, and it would remain that way for decades. As it would turn out, this would become one of the longest manhunts in the history of the state of California. Officer Milton Curtis, badge number 22, was only 25 years old when his watch ended July 22, 1957. He had only been with the El Segundo Police Department for 2 months. He was survived by his wife, Jean, and 2 young children, 1 son, Keith, and 1 daughter, Tony. In a television interview, Jean reflected on the memory of her husband, who had been her high school sweetheart, whom she married in 1952 while the both of them were still teenagers. "He was my first love," she said. "I never got over the first. I don't think anybody does, really." She recalled the evening he left for work, the last time she'd seen him. They'd actually had a small argument, and he left on those terms. She would carry those feelings of regret for the remainder of her life, as she said they never did say goodbye when he walked out that door for what she could not have known would be the final time. A few hours later, at the age of only 23, she became a widow. She got that knock on the door. You know that knock. Around 4 a.m. that her first love, her high school sweetheart, the father of her children, was gone. All she has left as a reminder of her husband's short life and career is a plaque from the El Segundo Police Department that has his actual badge on it. Officer Richard Phillips, badge number 10, was 28 years old when his watch ended on July 22, 1957. He had served the El Segundo Police Department for 2 years, and he was survived by his wife and 3 young children, Carolyn, Richard, and Pat. There are 4 stars that are found on the El Segundo Police Department's uniform shoulder patch, 1 for each El Segundo officer killed in the line of duty. 2 of them represent Officers Milton Curtis and Richard Phillips. The community of El Segundo woke up to the shocking news that 2 of its officers had been shot dead. And not only that, they found themselves right smack in the middle of arguably one of the most extensive and widespread manhunts in California history. Every resource that was available at the time was employed to try and locate this killer, this cop killer. And remember, rapist too. That connection was finally made to that 49 Ford. The man who'd slain these officers driving that stolen car was the man who'd stolen that car from those 4 teenagers and sexually assaulted one of them as well. But you see, the report of the stolen car, the sexual assault of the 15-year-old girl, and the robbery of the teenagers had not hit the police radios yet, at that time that those officers had pulled over that 1949 Ford. Gerald Mason, he thought it had. He was mistaken. Officers Curtis and Phillips hadn't the slightest idea what he'd just done. The only thing that they were going to do was give him a red light ticket. Even as Officer Curtis sat in his patrol car waiting for the information to be radioed back as to the vehicle's plates, whatever were to have come up, it would not have been reported stolen yet, nor had the rape or the robbery been reported either. So thinking that he'd be going to jail for a long time for what he'd done to those kids, he made the choice to kill those officers to save his own skin. And then to come to find out, the worst thing that was going to happen to him that night was going to be that ticket. It just adds another layer of senselessness and sadness to this whole entire story. When Mason left those kids naked and bound in that field, it was in the wee hours of the morning. Some time had passed before they were discovered by a passerby. By the time officers Curtis and Phillips were dead, these kids were just in the process of getting help. Nothing had been reported yet. And when the report was finally made as to what had taken place at the Lover's Lane, when the kids had finally been able to report their vehicle as stolen, the investigation into the officers' deaths were already underway. And it wasn't until then the stolen vehicle was connected to the killer of those police officers. Detective Howard Speaks was the lead crime scene investigator. He was one of the first to arrive at the scene of the shooting. He was tasked with making sure everything at the scene was documented. He first took pictures of the scene and the surrounding areas. He took photographs of the 1949 Ford, documenting the bullets Officer Phillips put through the vehicle as he was dying. Isn't it amazing how he was able to strike that vehicle right through the back of the window and through the trunk with 3 mortal bullet wounds to his own back and then call for an ambulance? It truly is, but it's also worth mentioning that Officer Phillips was one of the most skilled marksmen on the Segundo Police force, so it's no surprise that in his dying moments he got those 6 shots off, striking the vehicle 3 times. But dreamers, there is something even more amazing that Officer Phillips managed to do. You see, when crime scene investigator Sparks recovered only 2 of the 3 rounds Officer Phillips fired at the fleeing car, 1 round was missing. And dreamers, what do you think this told investigating officers about the whereabouts of that missing round? Yep, that bullet may just have struck the suspect. In his dying moments, did Officer Phillips manage to mark his murderer for life? Is this man walking around with one of Officer Phillips's bullets lodged someplace in his body? He may just be. Now, if investigators could only track this man down. Detective Sparks, the crime scene investigator, he wanted to make sure that he got everything right in his documentation of all the evidence at the scene and to ensure that he did not miss a thing. Of course, DNA wasn't around yet, and it wouldn't be for a very long time. So he did the best he could with what he had to work with, namely, his fingerprint kit. He took that kit and searched every single inch of that vehicle, looking for any print that might point them in the direction of a suspect. Detective Sparks hoped that whomever committed this crime was super nervous and it was a warm night, so he was hoping that the man would be sweating bullets, and sweaty hands leave good prints behind. His favorite place to look for prints is on the rearview mirror. It's the perfect surface for picking up solid prints. But the suspect had apparently not adjusted the rear view as he went along on his crime spree. But he did leave some prints behind on the steering wheel. Detective Sparks dusted the wheel with his brush. He went all around it until some ridges began to appear. 2 latent left thumbprints, both of them partial. Later on during the initial investigation, a lab technician layered the 2 prints together, one on top of the other, and both partial prints together created almost a whole thumbprint. And I don't have to tell you guys that prints are valuable evidence, but only if you can put a name and a face to that print. Don't forget, this is 1957. This was going to be an investigation conducted without any of the modern technology that we are all accustomed to today. Fortunately for investigators, they had several witnesses who got a pretty good look at the suspect. He had spent about an hour with those teenagers. They all got a good look at his face. And the officers who passed by the traffic stop saw him too. And they had a good idea of what his physical build was like. About 6 feet tall or so, maybe 200 pounds with short hair. The composite sketch of the suspect was developed. So, with the face and a thumbprint, investigators were confident that they'd apprehend their suspect in no time. Little did they know, it'd be a long time before they would. Gerald Mason, the man who'd hitchhiked his way across the country, making that pit stop in Shreveport to purchase that gun with the alias G.D. Wilson, finding himself in the South Bay area of Southern California, only to terrorize 4 teenagers hanging out on a summer evening, sexually assaulting one of them, and then go on to kill 2 unsuspecting young officers in cold blood, leaving a trail of devastation and heartache in his wake. When he abandoned that stolen Ford and fled, he became a ghost, leaving a community haunted with what he'd done that night. He carried on with his life. He found his way back to Columbia, South Carolina. He got married. He became gainfully employed. He became the owner of several gas stations in the area. He had children. He had grandchildren. His businesses afforded him a more than comfortable life. He had been able to amass a small fortune for himself and his family. Anyone who knew Mason, his neighbors, his friends, his golf buddies, his bowling league, nobody had a single bad thing to say about the man. He was sincere and genuine and kind and pleasant and affable, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a friend. He was retired and living out the rest of his years in his comfortable suburban home with his family, never having so much as a parking ticket on his record to speak of. In all the years that followed that night that he destroyed so many lives and left the police department and its community forever scarred. But you know what I have to say to that, old man? While you had the chance to have a life, a family, a career, a home, and a retirement, you robbed 2 young men of their chance to enjoy their own. You took them out before they'd even barely had the chance to get a start in life. And it infuriates me to no end that you went on for the next 46 years, unbothered, uninhibited, unfazed by what you'd done to those 2 officers, those 4 teenagers, and their families. Your evil actions continue to ripple through their lives for decades. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, you're living a successful, happy, unassuming life, never giving another thought to what you'd done. The hurt and the pain and the devastation that you caused with your cowardly, selfish actions. As I'm sitting here thinking about you and writing about you, and eventually tell anyone who's going to listen to this all about you and what you did, the one question I can't truly answer because you'd be the only one who could: how? How were you able to carry on as if July 22nd, 1957 was just a bump in the road of life? Was it just a night that slightly inconvenienced you? How could you just brush it aside like it was another day at the office? How could you run away, like the cowardly scum that you are, and go on and live your life like nothing happened? If I had to guess, Mr. Mason, if I had to try and come up with an answer as to how a human being could be capable of such behavior, I'd have one word for you, sir: sociopath. You may think that you've had your family and friends and neighbors fooled, But not us listening to your story, right, dreamers? We know your kind, and we know no matter how far away you move, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and your crimes, no matter how much time has elapsed, you are still the same man that you were that night. You robbed those kids, you raped that young girl, and you murdered those police officers. That is you, old man, a sociopath. Glib, superficial, cunning, manipulative, covertly hostile. You victimize people. You use them. You dominate them. You humiliate them. You're entitled. You have a grandiose sense of yourself. You lie. You're a pathological liar. You kept this massive secret from everyone you knew for 46 years, pretending like you were some kind of good guy. And you did it so seamlessly with so much ease. You went from rapist and killer to family man and business owner without so much as batting an eyelash, completely lacking of any guilt, shame, or remorse for what you'd done. You detached yourself from it. You compartmentalized it, pretended it wasn't a component of who you were as a man. You split yourself from that side of you and shoved it so deep down, hoping it would never, ever come to the surface. And you would be happy to go to your grave, perfectly okay with that. For you, the end, your ability to freely live your life, justified the means, murdering those two officers, because you were not going to let them stand in your way of getting what you wanted. You have no ability to show genuine emotion. You faked it for 46 years. Your entire life was a sham, and nothing about you is genuine or real. You have not the ability to love, truly love. You are callous. You are cold. You have no ability to empathize. You have no ability to understand the depth of the pain that you caused, as the only person you ever cared about was yourself. You would have never given yourself up. You would have never offered the families of those officers a measure of peace or closure. You selfishly kept that from them, kept it for the sake of your own happiness and freedom. And I don't care that you never so much as jaywalked over the years following your crime spree. I don't care how many lovely children and grandchildren you've raised. I don't care how many successful businesses you ran or jobs you created. I don't care how much of a pillar of the community you transformed yourself into. I don't care how good you are at golf, and I could care less if you could bowl a perfect game, sir. None of that matters. I despise what you did, and I despise you. As quickly as Mason drifted into Southern California, wreaked all this havoc, shattering the innocence of the times for so many people, he had just as quickly and quietly spirited himself away. 2 dead officers, killed while issuing a ticket, and 5 young babies left without their fathers. 2 young mothers left widowed to raise them alone. I cannot tell you how much it angers me that Mason went on and managed a good life for himself. He got to have his family. He was able to provide for them, love them, care for them, keep them safe, kiss them goodnight every night of their lives. He taught them how to ride bikes, how to drive a car. He got to play sports with them. He got to enjoy holidays and celebrate their birthdays. He got to see them graduate from high school, perhaps even college. He was there to help launch them into adulthood. He got to see them get married. Did he have a daughter, maybe? Did he get to walk her down the aisle? Did he get to go fishing or hunting or golfing or bowling on the weekends with his kids? He was blessed with becoming a grandfather, a comfortable retirement. he got to live out a long, fulfilling life with his wife right by his side. Little did she know the monster that she laid down with every single night. Every night for more than 4 decades. He got to have that. Ugh, I can't think about this anymore. Dreamers, nothing ever goes away. Nothing ever gets forgotten. Distance and time, they did not work in favor of Mason, the rapist and the killer. Time was working against him. Advances in technology would finally exhume the secrets that he thought were long dead and buried. Did he really think that El Segundo was ever going to stop looking for him? The man who was responsible for half of the 4 police officers ever killed in the line of duty within their department? I bet you guys he got so comfortable, so complacent. I bet he even stopped looking over his shoulder after a couple of decades. Before we move forward, let's back up a little bit. 3 years after the rape, robbery, and murders, in 1960, a man named Doug Tooley was doing some yard work in his Manhattan Beach home. Just digging up some weeds, stuff like that. Suddenly, his garden tool clinked onto something hard, something metal. It was a gun, at least a piece of the gun, the frame of a revolver. He kept digging around and he eventually found the cylinder of the revolver, along with some spent shell casings and some live rounds as well. Also found in his yard were 2 wristwatches. He turned the gun over to police, and because it was found at a home that was less than a mile from where officers Curtis and Phillips were gunned down, the neighborhood it was thought that the gunman had managed to disappear into, investigators immediately suspected that this was the murder weapon. It was sent in for ballistics testing, and the gun was a match to the rounds that were recovered from inside the Ford. This was indeed the gun that killed those officers. And the watches? Those were later identified as belonging to the 2 teenage boys he'd robbed earlier in the evening. Yes, 3 years had passed, but the wounds of that tragedy were still fresh, and finding this weapon breathed some life into a case that was growing colder and colder by the day, by the month, and by the year. In the moment, finding the murder weapon felt like winning the lottery. This was a huge, huge break for investigators. They were able to trace the serial number on the gun back to that Sears department store in Shreveport, Louisiana. Remember the young sales clerk who had sold him that 9-shot revolver for $29.95? Investigators back then in 1960 were able to go back and get the records of the sale and the handwritten log that was signed by the buyer with the alias G.D. Wilson. They started to canvass the Shreveport area, particularly in areas close to Sears, and they were able to trace G.D. Wilson to a local YMCA as well. He stayed there while he was in Shreveport before he hitchhiked the rest of the way to California, checking in under the name George Wilson. 1960s investigators talked to every single George Wilson they could find, but none of them were a match to the thumbprint they had. There are thousands of George Wilsons out there, dreamers, literally thousands. Mason may have been able to throw off investigators using that alias, but he did sign off on his stay for the YMCA and the purchase of the gun using his own handwriting. And just like your fingerprints won't ever change no matter how much time passes, sometimes your handwriting doesn't change that much either. And this, too, would come back to haunt Mason as well. They not only had the original sales log from Sears with the signature on it, they had the actual registration form he'd filled out at the YMCA when he stayed there, too. Unfortunately, this case that had just gotten white hot all of a sudden just as suddenly went ice cold all over again. All the evidence, boxes and boxes of evidence. By far the largest file within the El Segundo Police Department was quietly tucked back away on a metal rack down in the evidence room to resume its collecting of dust. Years and years of dust. And all was quiet again. From 1960, fast forward with me again, dreamers, 42 more years. 42 painfully silent years in the case of the deaths of two of El Segundo's finest to 2002. Something happened. A phone call came into the department, in September to be exact, from a woman who'd said that she might have some information about the murders of two officers in El Segundo. Her phone call thrust this case back up to the top of the department's priorities list. This phone call, this had been the most promising lead to be called in on the case, in practically forever. She said that she overheard her uncle boasting about killing two El Segundo officers. This prompted the assignment of two homicide detectives onto the case, Detectives Kevin Lowe and Dan McElberry. They were tasked with trying to solve the coldest case in the department. And fortunately for them, they had the advances in science and technology on their sides this time around. They would have to start digging through all of those boxes upon boxes of evidence in this case. The first thing they needed to do was to get that 1957 fingerprint and see if they could match it to that uncle bragging about having killed two cops. But that fingerprint, the actual lift that Detective Howard Speaks lifted off the steering wheel in 1957, it was on the verge of becoming fossilized and turning into dust. There were actual photographs of the print, but the actual lift was so fragile, it really could not be handled at all. And even the photographs were of a bad quality. So Detectives Lowe and McElberry had it sent to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab to see if they can work some magic on it. And they did. They cleaned up the image and enhanced the ridges by actually making a digital capture of it, giving the homicide detectives a nice, clear image of the print to work with. But when they compared it to that woman's uncle's thumbprint, it was not a match. He was not the man who'd shot and killed those officers all those years ago. I hope they read this guy the riot act, wasting all their time going around bragging about killing cops. Who does that? But despite this letdown, something good did come of this. A renewed interest in a very cold case. And with the marvels of modern technology, they were going to make good use of their brand new digitized fingerprint that they now had. One of the most effective tools for investigators, law enforcement, and the federal government was something that was to be born in the wake of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. A database. A huge database consisting of every single fingerprint of every single criminal to have ever had their fingerprints taken from every state across the entire nation. And that is a heck of a lot of fingerprints. The Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or IAFIS for short. The system was actually in the works for some years prior to 9/11, but that would be the event that would get the feds to get off their butts and start putting the system to work at its fullest potential in the wake of those hijackers having been able to plan their attack all the while on American soil. The system is maintained by the FBI, and it provides law enforcement with the ability to search for both latent prints, electronic prints, including digitally enhanced images. All in all, the system includes the fingerprints and criminal histories of 70 million individuals in the criminal file, 31 million civil prints, and 73,000 known terrorists. So Detectives Lowe and McElberry, anxious to put their access to millions and millions of fingerprints to good use, had their new and improved 1957 latent print put into the system. I took a look to see how long a search like this would take. A majority of the time is usually spent on cleaning up the print, so it was clear enough to be ran through the system, and that had already been done. They didn't have a suspect, so they would have to run through the entire database. And from what I read online, it takes about 2 hours. That's pretty amazing, right? 2 hours. 2 hours to put to rest a mystery that has endured for 46 years. I picture this kind of being like on NCIS or something, where the computer screen just kind of rapidly bleeps through fingerprint after fingerprint after fingerprint. Well, guess what, dreamers? It didn't even take that long. It was only minutes before the virtual Rolodex of fingerprints came to a sudden stop. A hit. A match. The fingerprint of the man who had shirked capture for close to half a century was right before their eyes. Gerald F. Mason. That pesky burglary arrest a lifetime ago. 2 generations ago. A year before he had robbed those teenagers, raped one of them, and murdered 2 officers in cold blood. The only time in his entire life that he'd ever been arrested. Those ink-rolled prints from way back in the day made their way into the FBI's database, and boom, you're done, Grandpa. In short order, investigators were pretty easily able to locate Mason, still residing 3,000 miles and 46 years away in Columbia, South Carolina. I've already ranted about his cushy life, so no need to go over that again. Detectives Lowe and McElberry wanted to jump on this guy so fast. Justice had been delayed long enough, right? But they wanted to make sure that they had a solid case against the old man. They figured they'd find a guy with a long and sordid criminal history. Robbery, rape, murder. That couldn't have been his only rodeo, could it? Well, essentially it was. A career criminal, Gerald F. Mason was not. He was one of those. One and done. Which, under different circumstances, I could appreciate. Life is all about second chances, isn't it? Redemption is a very real thing, but a price still needs to be paid before redemption can be achieved. At least that's how I feel about it in Mason's case. No matter how squeaky clean he had lived his life, none of that absolves him from the responsibility for what he'd done. He had 46 years to grow a spine, to have some integrity, to do the right thing. Even if he was afraid of being handed the death penalty, it was abolished in California for a time during the 70s. He could have turned himself in then, but no. He didn't care about the people he'd hurt. He only cared about himself. I'm sorry, I keep ranting on this. I'll stop. So Detectives Lowe and McElberry wanted more than just an old fingerprint to secure their case against Mason. They wanted a case that would be beyond any doubt to a jury that he was the man who had done this so long ago. And they figured that they could take their time. Even though they wanted him behind bars, he probably wasn't going anywhere. So they pored over the evidence that had been collecting dust for all those years in their evidence locker, looking for anything that was uncovered at any point that could tie Mason to the crime. And that would come in the form of that alias he had used, G.D. Wilson, all those years ago at the YMCA and at Sears. Remember that handwriting? As it turns out, 23-year-old Mason, 33-year-old Mason, 53-year-old Mason, and now 70-year-old Mason still had the same penmanship. One of the country's most renowned forensic document examiners, a gentleman by the name of Paul Edholm, He was recruited to take a look at the documents Mason had filled out and signed back in 1957. What he had to compare it to was a form that Mason had filled out in 1999 for an eye exam at his optometrist's office. And as soon as that document examiner got a look at both handwriting samples, the one from the YMCA and the one from the eye exam, side by side, he knew instantly that the person who signed both documents, 42 years apart, were one and the same. He was able to superimpose the G from George and the G from Gerald, and they were almost identical. There were more than enough of the same letters in George and Gerald and Wilson and Mason to be certain beyond any doubt that the writing was indeed his. Once Paul Edholm told detectives that he was 99.9% certain that the same hand filled out both documents, they could not get a warrant for Mason's arrest signed off by a judge fast enough. They hopped on a flight to South Carolina, and they paid Mr. Gerald Mason a little visit. The detectives were nervous, understandably. It was the morning of July 29th, 2003. They were about to go knocking on this man's door with a warrant for his arrest for murder, something he certainly went to great lengths to avoid. How would he react to them suddenly appearing at his doorstep? These officers were going to bring Gerald Mason's entire house of cards crashing down. They were going to come between him and his comfortable life and place him in prison for the remainder of his days. In the blink of an eye, they were going to destroy everything that he'd spent almost half a century building up. He was about to lose everything. Would he go quietly? Or would he do what he did the last time he was confronted by police? They were not taking this lightly. They knew all too well what he was capable of, so they proceeded with caution. Detectives Lowe and McElberry confronted him at his home. They introduced themselves as detectives from Los Angeles and that they were there to talk to him about something that happened in 1957. From what I could find online, it looks like they spoke to Mason at his home and recorded the conversation there, with someone else taking pictures of their first contact with him. They explained to him that they were investigating a crime that occurred back in July of 1957 where 2 police officers were murdered. His response? Quote, "My God, you're here for that reason?" Unquote. The detective answered, "Yes, sir." And with that, his jaw dropped. He kept telling the detectives that he didn't understand, asking if they'd really come there for him. The shock and disbelief was written on his face. He never answered them with any denials, though. He didn't proclaim his innocence. Other than being stunned, he was pretty much having no reaction at all. He just stared at the ground, shaking his head. El Segundo Police Lieutenant Craig Cleary, only 18 months old when Mason murdered officers Curtis and Phillips, was the one who placed Mason in handcuffs and took him into custody. Even though he was elderly now by this time, they still considered him to be a flight risk and considered him to be dangerous. And he may very well have been. They found an arsenal in his house, a collection of guns, many of them loaded. And when they finally had the chance to search his home, guess what they found he had amongst his collection of guns? Yep, he had one of those very rare Harrington and Richardson 9-shot 22mm revolvers. How depraved is this man, you guys? If we had chosen to believe that he had pushed these crimes so far deep into his subconscious, so he would be able to live and function as an average run-of-the-mill grandpa, and here we come to find that he actually had the same exact gun in his collection that he used to kill those officers. Unbelievable. But this time, he wouldn't be using it or any of his guns to shoot any officers in an effort to effect any kind of getaway. He gave up and he cried. His wife can be heard talking to officers, Mason crying to her, "I don't know, honey. I don't know what this is about." She asked the officers, "What are you going to do with them?" Mason answered, "They're going to put me in jail, honey. They're going to put me in jail." And to that I say, good riddance. Friends and neighbors immediately jumped to Mason's defense, describing him as a loving and caring husband and father, grandfather, and friend to everybody in the community. They were convinced that these fancy pants, big time Los Angeles investigators had the wrong guy. His neighbors all knew him. He was always willing to lend a hand. Just the most generous, kindest, gentlest of people. And I don't doubt that. It's very easy for sociopaths like him to pretend that there's something that they're not. A friend of his who actually really pissed me off when I saw his interview clip. He said that he had just played golf with him the day before he was arrested. He described Mason as a man who would give you the shirt off his back. And then, get this, he said, quote, "He wasn't a hardened criminal. He just made a mistake. He was a kid that went out and made a couple of mistakes, but on the same token, he's changed his life," unquote. Did you catch that, you guys? He said he made a mistake, that he was a kid and he went out and made a couple of mistakes and changed his life? What the actual what? Are you kidding me? He made a mistake? A mistake is turning right when you should have gone left. A mistake is forgetting to order your burger without pickles. A mistake is locking your keys in your car or overcooking your pasta or spilling your drink. Even running a red light could have been a simple mistake. But holding 4 teenagers at gunpoint, raping a 15-year-old girl, killing 2 police officers is what you call a couple of mistakes? Like, oh, whoops, did I terrorize and rob you? Sorry. Did I accidentally rape you and violate you in the worst, most heinous way possible? I didn't mean to. Oh, damn, did I just kill 2 officers too? My bad. Ugh, that guy just makes me so mad. Excusing away Mason's actions as juvenile mistakes. And he wasn't even a kid. He was 23 years old. This crime was premeditated way back when he was in Shreveport, purchasing that revolver. Likely even before then. He went to that lover's lane with that gun, that tape, and a flashlight. He might not have anticipated getting pulled over by police that night, but he sure as hell decided as soon as they did that they were going to die before they had the chance to figure out what he'd done. So no, you don't get a pass for this being a mistake a kid makes. And just because you went on to live a crime-free life on the straight and narrow doesn't give you a get-out-of-jail card either. Just no. Anyway, the prosecutor was a little bit worried about what a jury might think when they see this old, grandfatherly type man ushered in to stand trial for the double murder of 2 police officers a half a century ago. They believed in their case, that it was strong, and that it was prosecutable. They had Mason's fingerprint on the steering wheel of that stolen vehicle. They had the handwriting analysis that proved that he was the one that signed off on the purchase of that gun so many years ago. However, when they brought in Bob, one of those teenagers who had clearly seen Mason's face all those years ago, he was unable to identify him now, almost 50 years on in age. Eventually, 3 witnesses who were spoken to who saw Mason the night of the murder, they were absolutely able to pick 1957 Gerald Mason out of a photo lineup, not Old Man Mason. There was one more thing that the detectives had been wondering about. Remember when I told you that when Officer Phillips was shot 3 times in the back that, in his dying moments, he was able to fire off all 6 rounds that he had in a service weapon at the fleeing suspect? I told you that 3 of those rounds struck the Ford, 2 through the back window and 1 through the truck. And I also told you that the crime scene investigators were only ever able to recover 2 of the rounds, and that they surmised that the suspect may have been struck by one of Officer Phillips's bullets. Well, they wanted to find out. Was Gerald Mason struck someplace on his body by that bullet? When they finally had the chance to take a close look at him, they could see on his back, up near his right shoulder blade, that he had a scar. A scar that completed the story for investigators. Proof that, in his final moment, Officer Phillips marked Gerald Mason for life with that bullet. Mason was finally brought back to Los Angeles, California, where he was going to finally be made to answer for his crimes. And he would be made to face the family and colleagues of the men that he murdered. But there would be no trial. Mason could have fought these charges. He may have been able to impress the jury with his squeaky clean life, minus that one night. That anomaly, right? But he chose not to fight it. He didn't want to take this to trial. Why, though? Is it because enough was enough and it was time to face the music? Is it because he'd grown tired of the burden of carrying around all these secrets all these years? Is it because it was the right thing to do? No, it was none of that, if you ask me. He didn't want to take his case to trial for the same reasons he shot those officers and ran from justice all those ensuing years. Because he's a coward. He did not want to be made to stand before a judge and jury for the whole world to see what kind of a man he truly was, once all the layers of who he pretended to be were peeled away. Everything that he had managed to craft himself into to hide what he had done. The family man, the loving husband, doting father, proud grandfather, the businessman, the friendly neighbor, the helping hand, the pillar of the community, the weekend golfing buddy. If he had decided to plead innocent and go to trial, what was going to happen was the real Gerald Mason would finally be exposed to the world, and he would have to face his wife and his children. And he just could not face the shame and humiliation of what he'd done. Once a coward, always a coward. On Monday, March 24th, 2003, Gerald Mason was finally sentenced to 2 life terms, admitting in open court that he murdered officers Milton Curtis and Richard Phillips. A part of the plea deal was that the rape and burglary and grand larceny charges would be dropped. He did offer up an apology through some tears, but you could probably figure out what I'm going to say about that. While I don't think his remorse and sorrow is disingenuous, I don't think that at all, but I do think that it's all for himself. The now convicted murderer feels sorrow for himself. He's crying and grieving for all that he's lost, that he spent most of his adult life building up for himself and his family. All of his tears were tears shed for one man and one man alone, Gerald Mason. He said to the court and to the gallery, which included the children of the men that he killed, and some of the original investigators who were there that day investigating the crimes that he had committed. Yes, those very officers came in on canes and walkers to see this day. Even the actual crime scene investigator, Howard Speaks, the one who lifted those 2 partial thumbprints off that steering wheel so long ago, 88 years old by the time he laid his eyes on the man who left those prints behind for him to find. Even he showed up to court with the cumbersome hobble, his cane firmly gripped in his hand, just to finally be able to see this day of reckoning, a day he was convinced that he would never live to see. Mason addressed the court and offered up an apology, saying, quote, "It's impossible to express to so many people how sorry I am. I do not understand why I did this. It does not fit in my life. It's not the person that I know. I detest these crimes. Please believe I am still looking for ways to express my remorse for the horror that I've caused. I still do not want to remember what happened." Unquote. Yeah, I bet you don't. I bet that you hadn't thought about those officers and those teenagers and what you did to them for a really long time. I bet you thought that anyone who cared had either moved on or died. And my sentiments about this were echoed by Officer Milton Curtis's son, Keith. He was not having it, highlighting to the media the fact that Mason is saying he's sorry now, but he had not a care in the world about it for the past 46 years. Which leads just about everyone to feel, myself included, that the only thing Gerald Mason is really sorry for is that he was caught. Some of the officers' children had the chance to give their impact statements to the court, including Keith Curtis, telling the packed courtroom that his sister had passed away a year earlier, never having the chance to see their father's killer pay for what he'd done, and further speaking directly to the defendant said, quote, "This cold-hearted individual left a total of 5 children fatherless and 4 teenagers devastated for many years to come. Gerald Mason, your family may be shocked, but my family has been devastated." Carolyn Phillips, daughter of Officer Richard Phillips, presented an impact statement on behalf of her family, in part stating, quote, "Your cowardly act shattered our lives forever. You caused our mother to become a widow with 3 babies to raise alone. There is no way to describe our pain. There is no way to describe the emptiness and the anguish we have felt all of our lives without our dad. For all of this, we cannot and will not forgive you." Unquote. Investigators also wanted to know why. Why did all of this have to happen? I've gone over extensively as to why I think he did what he did, because he's a homicidal sociopath. But what does Mason have to say about it when asked why? After having just served that time in prison for that burglary all those years ago, why did he wind up in California with a gun? He would explain that he didn't have a family life and he really didn't have any place to go and that things just weren't going well for him, so he decided to head west to California. He claims to have bought that revolver in Shreveport to use for protection as he hitchhiked his way across America. When asked about why he did what he did to those teenagers and why he raped one of them, he claims to have not remembered. It's probably not that much of a stretch to believe that was the one thing he didn't want to be known as, a child rapist, and I can't blame him. Later on, when asked about the rape again, he excused it away as a, quote, "normal physical thing," unquote. When asked about why he killed Officers Curtis and Phillips, he had a pretty simple answer for such a horrific crime. It was either them or him, explaining that when Officer Curtis turned away from him, he shot him in the back, and then he shot Officer Curtis. Then he got back in the stolen car and drove away. So you know when something like this happens, when a conviction takes place long after the crime occurs, the defendant is charged with the crime as it was written the year it took place. Which means Mason was convicted under a 1957 double homicide law, which stipulates he would be eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 7 years. But the state of California has promised the families of the victims that he would never see the light of day again. Because the law allows a parole hearing for convicted criminals to be placed on the parole board schedule a year in advance, he got his chance after only serving 6 years. In March of 2009, Mason was up for parole, but his petition was denied, with the parole board citing that he has continually attempted to minimize the crimes, refusing to accept them for the very real and painful tragedy that he caused. He is disingenuous in his minimal attempts at showing remorse for what he's done, which doesn't surprise me. A man like Gerald Mason, Someone like him is incapable of feeling genuine remorse, at least that's how I see it. If he had been, these crimes would have eaten away at him over the years, don't you guys think? I mean, the way he flawlessly transitioned from rapist and cop killer to family man and businessman speaks to his sociopathy. And are we impressed at his ability to continue on for the rest of his life without ever having so much as a parking ticket to his name? Meh. Am I impressed that he behaved like a normal human being should be behaving? No, not me. I would even bet that it really had nothing to do with himself, or the crimes he committed, or the desires to set himself straight, to make up for his trespasses or discretions. No. I just think something else came along. Something outside of himself. Something that had nothing to do with him, but it was something that he wanted more than continuing down the path that he was headed. I think he got a break in life, perhaps when he got back to South Carolina. You see, like I talked about earlier, when Gerald Mason was born in 1934, this was right smack in the middle of the Great Depression. It finally came to an end when he was about 5 years old, and when the United States was thrust into World War II, triggered by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941, Mason was only 7 years old, missing out on a huge part of what would become known as America's Greatest Generation. And when the war ended, he was 11. Whatever happened to Mason over the next decade is unclear. He would have turned 18 in time to have enlisted in the military during the Korean War, but he didn't. And by the time he was 22, he had already started in with his criminal activity, culminating in the murders of those two El Segundo police officers. And you know, I like to speculate about this stuff, so what I think is that with the backdrop of America headed into one of the greatest periods in its history, post-World War II America, that Gerald Mason found himself to be a nobody in a sea of young men and women who'd returned from war, victorious, hailed as heroes. And there he was, insignificant. His life was meaningless and irrelevant. Like I said, a nobody. And this is all just a guess, as I'm trying to understand what kind of a place Mason was in his life at the time of his crime spree. So, with nothing much going on for him, not really being able to find gainful employment, and now having served time for that burglary, he drifted all the way to Southern California. He committed those crimes, and out of fear, he fled back to South Carolina. Everything he did once he killed those officers was out of cowardice. And when he arrived back in South Carolina, I think someone finally reached out to him, not knowing anything about what he'd done. And I think that someone gave him a chance. It was now a very economically prosperous time in America. Maybe someone offered him a job. And he met the woman he would go on to marry. Sometimes something as simple as meeting the right person can change your whole outlook on life. Maybe she was from a good family. Perhaps he'd finally found a support system. Maybe she provided him with something he'd been searching for. Maybe she filled a void in his life. And it was something he wanted more than being a criminal. So he pushed all that aside and lived a regular life. Well, that's just great for him, but for me, he doesn't get the credit for that. Everyone in his life who stood by him, supported him, loved him, cared for him, nurtured him, encouraged him, motivated him, all the while, unbeknownst to them, he was in fact a rapist and killer. They are the ones who enabled him to live a life on the straight and narrow. As he had already shown, when given the chance to be left to his own devices, he would choose being a criminal over doing the right thing. And at his parole hearing in 2009, his attorneys used the upstanding life that he had lived in the 46 years between his crime and his arrest. They presented pictures of Mason the family man, Mason the businessman, the good neighbor, the pillar of the community, But the board thankfully wasn't swayed. He was denied and basically told him to get back to them when he's 90. Gerald Mason, arrested 3 days after he turned 69 on January 29, 2003, died in prison on January 23, 2017, 3 days before he would have turned 83. To be exact, he eluded capture for 45 years, 6 months, and 8 days. And with that, we will bring today's episode, The Tale of the Scars We Bear, to a close. Please come on over to the Facebook page. I have help over there now, helping me drum up conversation and discussions about the cases we cover. Pretty much anything true crime related. Many thanks to Lisa, Valerie, and Darren for keeping the Facebook page a fun place to be. You can also find me on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. That's where I post pictures of the stuff related to each week's show. We got a lot of awesome feedback, not only about our main Sunday episode, The Tale of Torture in the Desert, but also the bonus, The Tale of the Boy in the Chimney. Come to think of it, I think most of you were moved by the bonus more than the primary show. I did get some responses that it was a bit too much, too graphic, and a hard listen. So perhaps I could steer clear of certain details in upcoming shows. I definitely don't want to turn people off with graphic materials. I also got some really good feedback about the Patreon episode that went up for the month of April as well. So if you don't want to miss out on that, you too can access all of the bonus content for just $1 a month. And for those of you who have jumped in at the higher tiers, I do have something especially planned for you. So hang tight and bear with me as I'm working to put that together as well. I have also launched a PayPal account for California Dreaming, so if you would like to make a one-time pledge, you can do that to keep our little production here chugging along. And if that's just not something that you can do, there's many other ways that you can support the show that doesn't cost you a thing, but a couple moments of your time. You, of course, can join and follow us on social media. You can rate and review the show on iTunes, preferably with 5 stars. It helps give the show more visibility. And if you don't have iTunes, you can leave a review on California Dreaming's official Facebook page. 5 stars would be great there too. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, where I am proud to be a part of a very, very talented group of podcast hosts across all different genres, from TV to film to gaming to history. Shows like The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Super Nerds UK, The Dirty Bits, Historium, Is This Adulting, 41 Owned, Film Roast, Vox Arcana, a Dungeons & Dragons podcast, and The Podience, a new show geared towards podcast hosts and aspiring hosts, giving you all the ins and outs of the podcasting world. You can find all of us on www.orbitaljigsaw.com. There you can also find links to our blog, The Vortex, where we write about and review other podcasts. And the links to our merchandise store are there as well, and you could support any of our shows with every purchase. Mugs, tote bags, hoodies, whatever. And lastly, I have a couple of promos to play for you before I let you go. Take a listen.
Hello, this is Michaela and Susan from True Crime 204.
We are a Canadian-based true crime podcast located in the former murder capital of Canada.
The two of us discuss serious topics with a hint of comic relief so you can sleep at night.
New episodes are released bi-weekly, and you can find us on all the socials and wherever podcasts are found at True Crime 204.
If you're looking for a new true crime podcast, be sure to check us out.
Welcome to the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast. My name is Michael, and each week I shall take you on a guided walk of hundreds of untold, unsolved and long-forgotten murders, all set within 1 square mile. Proving that, if you dig deep enough, you'll find that on every street, in every city, there's a killer on every corner, death on every doorstep, and homicide in every home. Murder Mile is investigated using original police files and eyewitness testimony, with authentic sounds recorded at the murder location itself, and is accompanied by photos, videos and maps to make you feel like you're actually there. A new episode of the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast is released every Thursday on almost every podcast platform. Thank you. Enjoy your day.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of California Dreaming, and until next time, sweet dreams.